and we are here today with Professor Jim Bigler. He's a visiting from Latin American Studies and from Policy at the University of Pacific. Now, thank you for coming here, Jim, again. And tell us a little bit more. How did you end up in the University of the Pacific?
I'm a graduate of the University of the Pacific. I studied here in the 1960s and had a great experience. And I've stayed in touch with the university over the years. And a few years ago, when the university was looking at redeveloping a program related to Latin America, I was invited to come back to the university, and so I decided to retire from the U.S. Foreign Service. And I had been a professor at the beginning of my career. I spent 14 years as a professor, and then I went in the Foreign Service and spent 21 years the U.S. government, and then I came back in 2005, retired from the Foreign Service, and so that's how I came back.
Drastic change from working in the government, such a big government agency, to being a professor. What do you like better? Or do you enjoy both? Or
oh yes, the interesting thing is that I love being a professor, and I, as I say, I was a professor for about 14 years, and I enjoyed it a good deal. But I was a professor in Arkansas in a small liberal arts college there, a very good one, and enjoyed it a lot. And it reminded me a lot of my experience. I was in the cluster colleges, a student in the cluster colleges, which we in those years we called experimental colleges at Pacific in the 1960s. So I've always been very interested in high-quality liberal arts education. And so being a professor at this small college, which is called Hendrix College in Arkansas, was very interesting for me. But it was in Arkansas. And it was hard to do international things from Arkansas. And my wife, who was actually German, but we were married in Ecuador and we lived many years in Latin America, she really missed the more international environment. After I'd been in Arkansas for 5 years, and I was offered a job in Washington as the director of research for Latin America for what's called the United States Information Agency. It's now part of the Department of State, but then it was a separate agency. And at the same time, I had done my PhD at Johns Hopkins University in Washington. My alma mater was interested in having me teach some classes there, so I would keep teaching. So I decided to take the job in Washington, and I thought I would do it for a couple of years, and then I would go back to full-time teaching. But what happened was I had a really good experience working in government in the first place. But then, while I was working in the Office of Research, and basically I would spend about 4 months in Latin America during research, mostly about public opinion in Latin America, but I was also involved in program research, and because that was what we did. So we'd evaluate programs, for instance, the Voice of America radio programs. I did a major evaluation of what the people in Latin America thought of Voice of America radio programs. Was one of the things that I didn't like about it was I had to spend so much time away from home doing research, and I much preferred living in Latin America if I was going to be there, and my wife did too. And it so happened one of the research jobs that I did related to drug problems in the Andean republics. And as a result of that research, I was offered a couple of jobs in the embassies in those countries to develop policies related to the drug problem. And as a result of that, I got an opportunity to actually enter the Foreign Service. And so I went to Peru with the intention of doing that job in Peru for 2 years, and then going back to academic life. But
that didn't happen.
It didn't happen because the experience in the Foreign Service was fantastic. Even though Peru was a very tragic place to live at that time, because of the drug violence, and the Shining Path guerrillas were terrible, and it was a tragic place to be in many ways. But on the other hand, the work was fantastic. It was fascinating, and it was a great challenge. And we made tremendous progress because one of the things that had happened was that the United States had had a very poor relationship with the government of Peru, and gradually we had a very progressive ambassador, and the determination of the Bush administration to improve our relations. That's President George H.W. Bush, or
The father.
the father, and the determination to improve our relationship with Peru was very strong. And Ambassador Watson had invited me to take this job in Peru and to work for him. And we made tremendous progress and actually developed a tremendous program of cooperation with the government of Peru. So the relationship between the United States and Peru completely changed during that period of time.
Wow.
And to be part of that was tremendous. And for instance, one of the specific parts of that was that one of the reasons why our relationship wasn't good was the Peruvians didn't want to cooperate with us in fighting drugs. So one of the things that we did is we designed a campaign to help educate the Peruvian people about drug problems. And one of the ways that we did that was we did some of the first satellite conversations between school students, high school students in the United States, with high school students in Peru. And they talked about the experience of drugs in their schools, okay? And the fascinating thing about it was that the Peruvian students described experiences that were just like the experiences of the students in Los Angeles. And the Peruvians at that time believed that it was a problem in the United States, but not a problem in their own country. And so when we organized that program, which was called Schools Against Drugs, it helped change the whole way in which the society saw the problem of drug trafficking.
Now has not been the only program that you have implemented where students connect several different countries. You have also worked with UOP and the students. Tell us a little bit more about that collaboration with students and throughout this Latin American universities.
Well, one of the things that we've done at the University of the Pacific is we've tried to revive a tradition that is very old at the university, but that had become less central to the experience, and that was the problem of the involvement of a broad range of students in international activities. It had become concentrated just in the School of International Studies, and so one of the things that I was involved in was the revival of the Inter-American program at the university. The idea of the program is to develop a number of ways in which students from the university will have experiences with Latin America and will create opportunities for students from Latin America to come to the university, to have more exchanges, to have more courses, to have programs in which we bring Latin Americans to the community. We have prominent visitors. The whole idea is that, in fact, many of our students in many fields of study will develop careers that will be linked to Latin America. And so we also wanted them to create a program in which they would develop the capacity to work professionally in Spanish, and that they would be able to recognize and overcome cross-cultural barriers to cooperation. So the Inter-American program is actually a certificate program for a student in any major in the university. It hasn't reached quite all the majors yet, but for instance, a student with a sociology in Inter-American studies, and what it requires that they do is that they demonstrate their proficiency to do professional work in sociology in Spanish as well as English, and they do that by examination. They have to take some courses in cross-cultural communications so that they show that they understand and can deal with cultural differences. And then they have to develop a project that they carry out in Spanish, and that could be in California, or it could be a project in Latin America. And for instance, we had a young lady who did a tremendous, fascinating project with the former braceros and the origins of the braceros in Mexico. And so that's the kind of the Inter-American program is, and then we've done things like invite President Vicente Fox to come for our graduation program, and we've tried to increase the closeness to Latin America. We've created some exchange agreements with universities in Mexico and Venezuela, and we had some pending in Chile, and we are looking at the possibility of others. But that's the idea.
All over the place. Now, you're very familiar with Latin America. You're the author and co-author of several books that deal with the socioeconomic and political and structures, and what do you think are the biggest challenges in Latin America to achieve a true democracy, if there is any modern challenges that they're facing today?
Well, overcoming there's a complex problem that's harder to describe in English than it is in Spanish, but in Spanish we use the concept of a caudillo, which is a charismatic leader.
Back to the Spanish conquest.
That it's related to the conquest because it's a figure that comes from the conquistadores. So there's part of it, but it's also related to the tradition of caciquismo, which comes from indigenous cultures, and it's a tradition that depends on leaders and the loyalty of followers to leaders, and of leaders to rewarding followers, to providing patronage to followers, that creates that people believe is the most efficient way to guide their society. There's still a widespread belief in this kind of leadership in Latin America, and Fidel Castro is a perfect example of a caudillo who has convinced a large part of his society that they're best off by allowing him to be their tyrant. And so it's very interesting, and it has very deep American roots. But at the same time, there is another value that is the value of liberty and the value of self-government, which are values that have developed in the American societies. And the fight for liberty, for political liberty and independence, has been going on in Latin America for over 200 years. And so the two things are there. And then there are other problems that relate to corruption, and that is a problem that's exacerbated by the tremendous inequality in the society. And the inequality is there in part because of the lack of equal access to education and other benefits. And there are lots of historical and cultural reasons why. But what I think a lot of people don't realize is how much the political institutions, how much social and economic progress the countries of Latin America have made in the last. Actually, I think most Americans think of Latin America is the image we have of Latin America is a historic image. Mm-hmm. What we're trapped. We North Americans are trapped with an image of Latin America at the time that we emerged as a world leader in the Cuban-American War, or the Spanish-American War, in 1898, and then the creation of the Panama Canal. The United States suddenly emerged as a world leader. Rather fossil conquest of Spain and the incorporation of Cuba and Puerto Rico and the Philippines into America, and we created a quasi-empire. And most Americans think of us as still being in that era. Do you want me to stop?
No, you're good.
Okay. The interesting thing is, at that period of time, in 1898 or 1900, around the turn of the century, the population of the United States was about 75 million. The population of all of Latin America was only about 65 million. So the United States was bigger. By that time, we had become the biggest and the most industrialized country in the world. We had just entered the world stage as one of the most powerful countries. it was easy for us to throw our weight around and do whatever we wanted in Latin America. And that was one of the reasons why we invaded Mexico many times, and we used force wherever we wanted, and the United States really kind of threw its weight around. And we tend to think of the countries of Latin America as being small and impoverished and not very important. Well, that isn't today's world. Today, the countries of Latin America have together almost 600 million people. In other words, the United States was bigger than all of Latin America combined, but now Latin America is more than twice the size of the United States. In 1900, only between 1 and 2% of our population was Hispanic, although we had always had a Hispanic element because part of our territory came from Mexico. But in fact, the population in the Hispanic contribution was very small, even in California and New Mexico, for a variety of reasons, but it was relatively small. Today, it's 16% of our population. So, you know, one of the things that has happened is nature of our relationship has changed dramatically. And right now, for instance, our second most important trading partner in the world is Mexico. And people think, well, how can you compare Mexico to China? But the people don't realize that we export almost 3 times as much to Mexico as we do to China. It's export that produced jobs in the United States. Not what we import far more from China, but that actually is what costs jobs in the United States. Americans think that we lose the jobs to Mexico, but in fact we lose the jobs. We don't actually lose jobs. What happens is that capitalism is an economic system that is constantly creating and destroying. It's successful at creating economic growth precisely because it eliminates economic activities that are no longer efficient. And so there's constant change, and we need to understand that. And so the fascinating thing is we have this new relationship with Latin America.
You know, looking at like Mexico, for example, they just legalized gay marriage, something that can never happen here. I don't see it happening in the United States. We have in Chile a woman who is a president, or who was, I'm not sure. So those are smaller changes that the United States still hasn't come to it yet.
I would actually, I'm not sure. We certainly haven't had a woman president yet, and it's tremendous because Michelle Bachelet, who was the president of Chile, was a wonderful, and today Dilma Rousseff, who is the president of Brazil. These are tremendous professional women. Their societies benefit from their leadership, and for incorporating women in political life. One of the things that we should be very embarrassed about in the United States is that only 17% of the members of our Congress are women today. That we have about 20 states that don't have a single woman representing them in Washington, D.C. And that's terrible because Congress makes policy for all the United States, and to not have women participating is terrible. That means women's perspectives aren't taken into consideration the way they should. So, yeah, I agree that there are some of these things, but I think that one of the important things is that we actually learn from our Latin American neighbors. And there's evidence that we are learning more. It isn't great, but I think the disposition for us to learn now is increasing, yes.
No, Jean, one of my last questions, when you talk about Latin America and Venezuela and Peru, countries where you lived, you talk about it with so much passion. Where does your passion comes from in Latin America? What did you experience, or why? Where did this passion come from?
Well, it comes from my upbringing in Southern California, in which I grew up in a barrio with Chicano neighbors. And other friends from Latin America. From the time I was in grade school, I had friends who were immigrants from Latin America. And so, for instance, when I was in junior high school, I learned to do Argentine folk dances from Argentine immigrants. I remember taking some an Argentine family that had just arrived in the United States, and they came from the southern part of Argentina, where there are no blacks at all. Okay, and they had two little children, and they were children of maybe 5 and 7 or something like that. And here we were at the Orange Show, which is a national, kind of a fair, and we're having a great time. And all of a sudden, the two little children come running up to us, and they say, gente negra, son tan sucios, mami. ¿Por qué son tan sucios? And it was just this, having that kind of rich exchange from an early age. And then I came to University of the Pacific as a student, where I formed lifelong friendships with students from all over Latin America. And so to this day, I made my first really professional visit to Chile just a couple of years ago. And in my first visit to Chile, 12 classmates were there to receive me and help me make my way in the country the first time I did professional work. And I have friends and classmates every place that I've been. Even Cuba, I had friendships in Cuba that with people that I had known in other countries. So by the time I went to Cuba to work, I already had friends there. So I've always believed that that the lack of understanding between our cultures was one of the things that caused our problems. It's funny when you think about things from the perspective of a child. But for instance, I remember a Chicano family where when I was in elementary school, I spent a lot of time with, because my best friend's family and I used to, and my friend Ruben had a great uncle, Tio Abuelo, right, who was a wonderful man, and he was always trying to learn English. And every time I went to visit the house, he would have me sit and help him learn English. And by the time I'd been doing that for a couple of years, I suddenly one day realized that I was learning a lot of Spanish.
And he was learning
but
English.
He wasn't learning much English. And I came to the conclusion, well, why doesn't everybody learn Spanish? Because it's so much easier than learning English. And, another experience that, when you think about it in retrospect, when I was in the 6th grade, we had to do a report about a great leader of society. And everybody would choose people like George Washington and Abraham Lincoln and so forth. And I had heard about this great man from South America who was called the George Washington of South America, Simón Bolívar. So I report about Simón Bolívar. I had completely forgotten about that, but about 10 years ago when my father died, and we were, excuse me, we got to edit this.
No
I get emotional.
We totally understand.
But when my father passed away, through his things, and I think, my dad was trying to figure out how I had become so linked to Latin America. And he had a whole bunch of things of mine. And one of the things he had was this report that I had done
about
Simón Bolívar in the 6th grade, in which the interesting thing is, I'll never forget it, because I got in trouble, but I learned that his name was Simón Bolívar. Now, when I had gone to have my first conversation with my dad about Simón Bolívar, he'd said, Simon Bolivar. And my dad, who was a self-educated man, knew about him And he was Simon Bolivar to my father. But when I corrected him and said, "No, Dad, you pronounce it Simon Bolivar," I got in big trouble. And so I also learned about the delicacy of cultural issues and relations and understanding. And so one of the things that has always been important to me, when I was a student, I developed an identity. I've always thought of myself as a Californiano.
And that's what you are, right? Well, thank you, Jean. Thank you for sharing with us, so many stories and being here with us at the Bilingual Weekly.
Now, we didn't talk much about community work.
Oh, you have such a fascinating story as a person. We touch on the local community.
Okay, well, because I wanted to tell you about our Puentes garden.
Ya me emocioné aquí. Now, Dr. Bigler, I know you're also part of the board members at Puentes, our local garden, urban garden, actually. Tell us a little bit more of how the project is coming along, because it's starting to look, more like a garden now.
We've got produce out there, and we are going to start delivering produce to families the 1st of June. And we're now ready to sign contracts so that every week we will deliver a box full of fresh organic produce that will all be raised organically right here. Part of it on our own farm, but other organic farms. But the whole idea of Puentes is that, we have in the Boggs Tract community about 10,000 fellow citizens that don't have access to fresh fruit and vegetables. Mm-hmm. And it's the quality of their diet is just terrible. So one of the objectives is to improve their diets. But at the same time, if we can help them learn principles of sustainable agriculture, they can develop products that are organic and therefore that are better in quality, that are better for their environment, but that also will give them an opportunity to produce a revenue stream that will add. These are people that are underprivileged. It's a relatively poor neighborhood. It can be an important contribution to the family budget. And so the idea of Puentes is to experiment with the development of an efficient model of developing a community farm, and then find ways to share that model with other communities. Mm-hmm. And eventually, we also want to develop projects with our Latin American neighbors. We're exploring the possibility of some projects right now in Panama. One of the reasons why I got involved is because I'm so deeply involved still with Panama. And so, right now, we're concentrating on making that farm work and serve that community and provide produce for consumption of families right here in Stockton.
It's important because a lot of us don't realize that hunger is a problem in Stockton. It's in our own community. Yeah. So if this is a way to defeat it, I think it's very important. Yeah. And thank you again. Okay, thank you, Dr. Bigler, for being here with us and sharing all your memories and your emotions and your knowledge with us. Thank you.